Hey guys, welcome back to my channel for another video. Now before we get into this one, I just want to address the fact that I've got brand new lighting, which is definitely going to be a learning curve for me. I've never really used any kind of studio lighting and stuff for my videos before, so I have no idea what I'm doing, so please bear with me for the next few videos. If things are looking a little bit dodgy, I have no idea what I'm doing. But anyway, this week we're talking about the disappearance of Renee and Andrew Macrae. This is one of Scotland's longest running mysteries. It was Friday the 12th of November 1976 when Renee Macrae and her 3-year-old son Andrew disappeared. They're both presumed murdered and the investigation is still ongoing to this day. Renee grew up in Bewley near Inverness with her sister Morag and their parents. Now Morag and Renee were really close growing up, and they were close even when Renee disappeared. As a teenager, Renee attended beauty school, which is where she met her husband-to-be Gordon Macrae. In 1963, when Renee was 23 years old, they married. When they were teenagers, shortly after they first met, Gordon joined his father's small construction company, and eventually he took this company over. Within years, he managed to turn this from a small business into a thriving company with an annual turnover of £30 million. So Renee and Gordon were pretty well off. In 1968, a few years after they got married, Renee gives birth to the couple's first son, Gordon Jr., and Renee absolutely loved being a mother. She was devoted to her son. However, her marriage was really troubled. Her and Gordon were dealing with a lot of stuff. They definitely weren't happy together. But 5 years later, she falls pregnant again and gives birth to Andrew in 1973. However, unknown to her husband, Renee had been having an affair since 1971 with a man called Bill McDowell. Now, Bill McDowell actually worked at Gordon's firm. He was an accountant, he worked in finances, and they had a very long-running affair. As you can probably guess, Andrew was Bill's son and Gordon was none the wiser. In 1975, Gordon and Renee split. They just weren't happy. They hadn't been for a very long time. So Gordon leaves the family home and leaves Renee there with their 2 sons. It was a luxurious bungalow. Obviously, they had quite a lot of money. And Gordon said that he had his suspicions that Renee was having an affair, but never really knew it for certain. But the 2 remained good friends. They only ever had good things to say about the other, whether that was for the sake of the children or if they genuinely still loved each other and got on really well, you don't really know. And Gordon continued to financially support Renee so she could stay at home and raise their 2 sons, and obviously Gordon was well off so he could afford to do this. Now, no one knew about Renee and Bill's affair apart from Renee's best friend Valerie Steventon, who she finally confided in when she fell pregnant with Andrew. And even after Renee and Gordon split, Renee still couldn't be open about the affair that she'd been having because Bill had a family of his own. He had a wife and 2 children. But according to Renee, Bill had promised her that he was going to leave his wife and the 2 of them were going to start anew. Bill told her that he'd been offered a job with Texaco in the Shetland Islands, and the 2 of them were going to move out there together, and Renee was going to bring Andrew along. Renee was besotted with this man, and she totally believed him when he said that he was going to leave his wife for her. She'd even started to pack up her house for their move to the Shetland Islands. Renee disappeared on Friday the 12th of November 1976. That morning she'd met up with Valerie and they'd had a coffee, and Renee was telling her how excited she was to move away. And we're not entirely sure what Renee did that afternoon, but we know that she went to pick up Gordon Jr. from school and then headed to her husband's office to drop Gordon off. You see, Renee had a romantic weekend getaway planned with Bill, and Bill had asked her to bring Andrew along because he wanted to get to know his son. And Renee confided in Valerie that she really couldn't be bothered to go. She had a lot to do, she had loads of stuff to pack up. If she and Bill were moving to the Shetland Islands, she had to pack up the entire house and she just didn't really have time for a romantic weekend getaway. But she was going to go anyway because Bill wanted to know his son. So once she's dropped off Gordon Jr. at Gordon Sr.'s office, she says to Gordon Sr. that she's going down to Kilmarnock to visit her sister for the weekend and that she'd be back by Monday afternoon to pick up Gordon from school. Gordon later said that he suspected that she wasn't being completely honest with him, but it didn't really matter to him. They'd been separated for over a year at this point. They were good friends, and Gordon had actually already moved on. He was living with his secretary, so what did he really care if she was going off with some man? So he says goodbye to Renee and Andrew and they leave. This would have been around 5 p.m. She walks back to her car, a BMW, and puts Andrew in the back seat and puts the pram and her luggage in the boot. She starts to drive. She turns south onto the A9 in the direction of Perth. which is where her weekend getaway with Bill was supposed to be. But as you can probably guess, Renee and Andrew never arrive at their destination. It was shortly after 10 PM when a bus driver is driving down the A9 and notices flames and smoke coming up from the embankment. And seeing as he's got no passengers on the bus, he decides to pull over and check it out. He sees the flames about 12 miles south of Inverness by a place called Macrae Farm. Upon his investigation, he finds a blue BMW in flames, but no signs of anyone about. Now, the car had only been driven for 12 miles, which is about a 30-minute drive, but here it is being discovered at 10 PM when she left about 5 PM. So what was she doing in those 5 hours? Because the car certainly wasn't on fire for all of that time. There was a train driver who came forward saying he saw some flames around 8 PM that night, which kind of shortens the time gap here if that is correct, but still that's 3 hours where we don't really know what Renee was doing. The police and the fire brigade arrive at the scene shortly after 10 PM once the bus driver calls for them, and they trace the owner of the car the next day. The owner of the car is Gordon Macrae. Now, of course, it was Gordon's car, but he sort of lent it to Renee for her to drive. Now, he told the officers this and said that she was driving to Kilmarnock to visit her sister, and if they weren't in the car, then he has no idea where they could be, unless they'd caught the train or the bus or some other form of transportation to get down there. Because nobody had died in the car. Although the car was on fire, there were no bodies inside of it. The police found absolutely no trace of them inside apart from one large blood stain in the boot, and the blood type matched Renee's. Naturally, the police call Morag to see if Renee's there, and of course she isn't. Now, I don't know if Renee told Morag that she was using her as a little alibi for a weekend getaway. I don't think she did, so I think Morag was a little bit confused and concerned when she was getting calls asking if Renee was there, and she had no idea about any of it. The Morag calls Valerie just to see what's going on, and Valerie says to her like she shouldn't worry, Renee's just gone on a weekend trip away, she'll be back Monday, there's nothing to worry about. And Morag knew that Renee was having an affair, but didn't know who with. At this point, Valerie genuinely wasn't concerned. Maybe she was in denial and just telling herself a different story. But Valerie 100% believed with all of her heart that vandals had stolen Renee's car and set it on fire on the side of the road, and that Renee had just caught the train down to Perth for her weekend away with Bill. However, on Monday morning when Renee hadn't arrived back, Valerie does start to get concerned. So she calls Bill McDowell's house. She literally calls long enough for somebody to answer, and when she hears the man's voice, Bill's voice, she knows that something is up because Bill's at home. Where's Renee? Now, everyone knew that Renee would never have abandoned her oldest son. Despite some of her very poor life choices she made, she was a good mother and would do anything for her kids. So when Renee didn't turn up to pick Gordon up from school on Monday, immediately everyone knew that something awful must have happened. She wasn't a suicide risk, but even if she was a risk to herself, she would never have harmed Andrew as well. She had no mental health problems that anyone knew of. The only explanation that people could come to was that she had been murdered. Volunteers scoured the area, all the surrounding fields and the roads, and experts from all over the country arrived to help look for Renee and Andrew. Houses were checked, BMW experts looked at the car, divers went in the local lakes, helicopters used heat-seeking equipment. Nothing showed any clues. This intense search lasted for 2 weeks, and police were desperately trying to put together Renee's afternoon, trying to figure out where she was and what she was doing, and they've never really been able to figure it out. No matter what they do, there's always these 3 hours they just can't piece together. A witness who had driven on the A9 that night came forward saying that he'd seen a man at the side of the road dragging what he thought at the time was a dead sheep. However, Renee, on the night she disappeared, was wearing a white sheepskin coat. There's a very big possibility that what this man saw wasn't a dead sheep at all, it was Renee. Someone else also reported seeing a man with a pushchair walking very near Macrae quarry. The investigation was not an easy one. All of Renee's deceit over the years had spun a very complicated web that the police found really difficult to unravel. The extent of the affair eventually came to light when Valerie finally spoke to the police. She went to them and said that Renee was having an affair. She told them everything, including that it was Bill McDowell and that Andrew was Bill's son and not Gordon's. Now, as you can probably guess, Gordon pretty quickly turned around and fired Bill from his company. For Gordon, this was a complete shock because he considered Bill one of his friends, and not only now has his son and his wife gone missing, but he's now found out that his son wasn't even his. Detectives confront Bill in his home where he admits to the affair but denies that he ever had any plans to leave his wife for Renee. He said that he'd grown tired of the affair, however Renee clearly thought that she was going somewhere because her entire house was packed up. So if Bill's telling the truth and they never had plans to go anywhere, where did Renee think she was going? Bill also said that the two of them had a secret coded phone system where they'd call each other and let it ring a specific number of times before hanging up. So they always knew when it was the other, it was how they'd sort of plan their secret rendezvous and stuff. And Bill actually said that after Renee disappeared, he got these calls 2 or 3 times, and so he assumed that she was still alive somewhere. About a week after the disappearance, Bill walks to Inverness police station to make a voluntary statement. He's in the police room about to give the interview when his wife comes storming in, and she grabs him and drags him out of the room and says to the police to leave her husband alone. Throughout everything, Bill's wife Rosemary has always stood by his side. She never left him even once the affair came out. She's always insisted that he's had nothing to do with it. A few years later, they actually moved down to London with their kids and they're still together to this day. Bill completely denies having any involvement in Renee's disappearance, but for obvious reasons he's still a pretty big suspect. But he says that this disappearance has blighted his entire life since the day she went missing. Also, about a week after the disappearance, Gordon offers the public a £1,000 reward for any information leading to the discovery of Renee or Andrew. But eventually, of course, the investigation starts to go quiet because the police have not found anything. The search was coordinated by Detective John Cathcart, and after about 8 months, it seems that he finally has a breakthrough, the first moment in this investigation where something has actually happened. So his superiors finally gave the go-ahead to start digging down Macrae quarry. The theory was that if their bodies had been buried anywhere, it was most likely in this quarry, and Cathcart had been fighting to dig there ever since the investigation first started. One day in April 1978, a digger removes a top layer of soil, and this awful smell comes up from the ground. Cathcart said that it smelled like decomposition. He knew the smell well, he knew what it was, and he became convinced that Renee and Andrew's bodies were buried underneath. However, on the following Monday, he's actually told that they need to stop digging because they're short of funds and the diggers need to go back to the contractors. And so that's that. And so the case dies down. There's no huge breaks or leads in the case until 2004 when a cold case review is launched. In August of 2004, they go back to Macrae quarry where they remove 2,000 trees. See, in the previous 20 years it had gone through a huge landscaping thing, loads of trees have been planted to try and make it like prettier for the environment, and they just went in, took down all the trees, and they started to do a proper search. This search lasted for 3 weeks. They moved 20,000 tonnes of soil, but all they found were 2 crisp packets from around the 1970s, some men's clothing, which is presumably from workers around the time, and some animal bones. That's it. They never found any bodies, so they can now put this line of inquiry to rest. They're definitely not buried in there. Some now think the bodies are actually buried underneath the A9. See, at the time that Renee disappeared, there were loads of roadworks going on, and people think that Renee and Andrew could have been buried in the foundations of the road. However, the police will not dig up and search because they said they're satisfied the bodies are not there. Over the years, of course, the police have received a variety of different letters from people claiming that they know exactly what happened to Renee and Andrew, and that this person had something to do with it, that Andrew was currently living abroad and is still alive, but Renee's dead, that Renee sold Andrew. All these crazy conspiracy theories. The police have heard everything. There were even theories that the police were complicit in Renee's death themselves, and that's why they're not willing to dig up the A9 because they know they did it. Another cold case review happened in 2006, and this one cost £250,000. But again, nothing came of it, which is really frustrating. No one was prosecuted or arrested. However, a suspect was named, not publicly, in the official police report. So the police have their number 1 suspect. We don't know who it is, although we can take a good guess. However, the report said, and this is a direct quote, "Following full and careful consideration, the Crown Counsel concluded that there was insufficient evidence for any criminal proceedings at this time." I mean, when you think about it, there's only 2 people who could be possible suspects in this case: Gordon Macrae or Bill McDowell. And there's also a possibility as well that it could be completely random. Any person could have carjacked Renee's car and hurt them. So we're going to start with Gordon, and I'm going to say outright that I really don't see much of a motive here. Unless I've missed something very, very important, I don't really see any way that Gordon could have done this. You could argue that Gordon was angry at Renee for having an affair, and that day he snapped. He knew that she was going away with whoever this guy was, and he was done with it, and so he hurt her. But they had been separated for over a year. Everyone said they were really good friends. They got on really, really well. Gordon had moved on himself. He was living with another woman. So I just find this very unlikely. And also Gordon had no idea that he wasn't Andrew's biological father, so that couldn't be a motive. I didn't see anything about Gordon having an alibi that night, so this is just speculation on my behalf. But I'm pretty sure if Gordon was at the office with his son, they would have been there for a little while longer. People probably would have seen them together. And he had no one to look after his son. So he did go out and he wanted to harm Renee. Why would he harm Andrew as well? But also he would have had to have sent his son Gordon Jr. somewhere to be looked after. And nobody's ever come forward saying they were babysitting Gordon Jr. that night. Of course there is a possibility that he took him with him, but it was a 5-year-old boy and he probably would have said what he'd seen. Gordon was also very vocal and very active in the media about finding Renee. He even offered a monetary prize for anybody who gave him any information. And it's just highly, highly unlikely that he would sort of fight so much trying to find out what happened to Renee if it was actually himself, because any information that anybody brought forward could harm him. So yeah, I just find this one very, very unlikely. A lot of people do say that Gordon could have hired a hitman to hurt Renee, which is a definite possibility. So it was him, but he wasn't like involved himself. But again, you've got to ask, what is the motive? The number one suspect here is Bill. Now he does have an alibi for that night, which was provided by his wife, who said that he was at home with the family all night. And why would she lie for him here? He'd been having an affair. Nobody would blame her if she turned around and said no, he wasn't here. She would have been angry at him, but no, she stood by her husband and has done ever since this day. Was she possibly embarrassed by the affair? Was it pride? Did Bill harm Renee at Rosemary's request? Bill remained radio silent on Renee's disappearance for 28 years. He did not say anything about it. He refused to speak to the media. He said that it haunts him, that the media hounded him. However, finally he broke his silence in 2004 and he went in the media and said that he had nothing to do with the disappearance. And of course there's every possibility that he was telling the truth. However, Bill had a motive. He was wanting to end the affair. He'd said that he had grown tired of it. He just wanted to be with his family. But he had this illegitimate child. He had Andrew. And so no matter what he did, he was tied into Renee for life. Renee had nothing to lose by going public about the affair. However, Bill had everything to lose. Not only his wife and his family, but his job as well. Of course, Gordon would have fired him immediately, and he did. Did he possibly meet Renee in the lay-by that night where he had this premeditated murder all planned out? Or did Renee go and pick him up at his house and they drove out, and when they were driving, he harmed her? According to Valerie, Bill insisted that Renee brought Andrew along that weekend after never really showing much interest in getting to know his son. So was he trying to kill two birds with one stone? The one thing the police have always said about this murder is that it was meticulously planned. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Or like the previous theory I mentioned about Gordon, did Bill possibly hire somebody to do his dirty work? So when his wife did give him an alibi saying that he was at home that night, he actually was. And just a quick side note here, which I thought was very interesting. Bill was an accountant. He worked in finances, and disaster seemed to follow him wherever he worked. Financial records were destroyed in 4 separate fires at 4 separate companies that he worked at. Either this is a bit of a pattern, or he is the unluckiest guy who ever lived. Is he trying to cover up some dodgy finances? In 1990, he was actually charged with dishonesty and forgery involving sums totalling £240,000. So he wasn't exactly a model citizen. But at the end of the day, there's no proof of anything. There's no proof that Bill had anything to do with it, or Gordon, or anyone else. They've just got nothing. And they likely will continue to have nothing until Renee and Andrew's bodies are found. And even if they are found, there's no guarantee that they'll have any evidence on them, which is any more help. I think it's pretty clear that the police have their own theory as to who did this, and I'm sure you guys do as well, so I'll look forward to seeing them all in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to my channel if you're not already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.